Yes, it is August 22nd, 1940, and the summer sky over Kent is being carved apart by German bombers. Squadron Leader James Peel watches from the control tower at Biggin Hill, one of RAF Fighter Command's most crucial bases, as Messerschmitts streak across the landscape below. But something is wrong with the enemy's bombing pattern. The heaviest attacks are not falling on the runways and hangars where his Spitfires are parked. Instead, the explosions are erupting 2 miles away, in a field that contains nothing but dummy aircraft and wooden structures. The Germans, it seems, have been looking at the wrong piece of England entirely. They are bombing a place that does not truly exist, and in doing so, they are wasting tonnage after tonnage of ordnance that might otherwise have destroyed the very aircraft tasked with defending the nation. This was no accident. It was the deliberate work of a small group of engineers and artists who had realized something profound. In total war, sometimes the most effective weapon is not something you build, but something you create that nobody ever sees. For the next 3 years, whilst the Luftwaffe pounded what they believed to be British airfields, they were actually attacking phantoms. The decoy airfield network was perhaps Britain's most successful deception operation of the Second World War, yet it remains one of the least known. It is a story about how 2 miles of distance, some canvas, wood, and clever camouflage saved countless lives and cost Germany resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. It is a story about how sometimes the best defense is not to fight, but to be invisible. The crisis that forced Britain's hand was unprecedented in its speed and ferocity. In the summer of 1940, as Nazi forces swept across France and the Low Countries with bewildering speed, the Luftwaffe turned its attention westward across the Channel. The Battle of Britain was not merely a military campaign, it was an existential struggle. If the Germans could achieve air superiority over the British Isles, invasion would follow. The Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF were brave, and their pilots braver still, but they were fighting a mathematics problem that seemed impossible to solve. Germany had built roughly 4,500 fighters and bombers. Britain had perhaps 2,000 operational aircraft, and losses were catastrophic. In the first month of sustained bombing, between July and August 1940, the RAF lost over 200 fighters. Pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. Airfields themselves, the very foundation upon which air defense rested, were being systematically destroyed. Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Debden, North Weald, one after another, these vital installations were cratered and set ablaze. The infrastructure supporting air defense was crumbling. Fuel storage, ammunition dumps, aircraft assembly facilities, all of these were being systematically targeted with devastating accuracy. The Germans seemed to know exactly where to look. They had reconnaissance photographs, intelligence reports, and the advantage of numerical superiority. Britain needed a solution, but there was no easy answer. You cannot build new aircraft fast enough to match the losses. You cannot train pilots quickly enough to replace the dead. But what you might do is redirect the enemy's violence away from where it matters most. What if, instead of defending every airfield, you created false ones that looked more valuable than the real thing? What if the Luftwaffe, with its limited bombing capacity, wasted that capacity on targets that did not exist? In October 1940, the Air Ministry formally established the Camouflage Unit, though its most important arm was something else entirely: the Decoy Airfield Service, or DAS. Leading this extraordinary enterprise was Wing Commander John Hemingway, an experienced officer who grasped immediately that this was not merely a technical problem, but an artistic one. The decoys would have to be convincing enough to fool high-altitude reconnaissance photography, visible enough to attract the attention of German planners, and constructed quickly enough to stay ahead of the shifting strategic situation. The design process was ingenious in its specificity. Rather than building crude approximations, Hemingway and his team studied actual RAF airfields meticulously. They noted runway dimensions, the spacing of fuel dumps, the precise layout of aircraft dispersals, the patterns of taxiway markings. Then, across the countryside, they began constructing replicas that were sophisticated enough to deceive. The framework for these fake aircraft was built from timber, the famous British softwood that had once been intended for other purposes. The fuselages were constructed from wooden frames covered in canvas and painted with meticulous attention to scale and shadow. From the air, at altitude, these dummy Spitfires and Hurricanes appeared absolutely convincing. But the aircraft were only part of the deception. The airfields themselves required enormous work. Runways had to be marked out, sometimes using lime, sometimes using darkened earth, positioned and shaped identically to genuine operational bases. Hangars were simulated using timber frames and canvas, painted and weathered to look real. Control towers were built to specification. Bomb craters were even deliberately created in some areas to make the airfields appear recently damaged and therefore currently active. The construction and maintenance of these phantom bases employed hundreds of workers. By the end of the war, the decoy airfield service had expanded to oversee not individual airfields, but entire parallel landscapes. The scale was staggering. Where Britain had roughly 30 major RAF airfields, the decoy network eventually included over 200 fake installations. Some of these were distributed around the genuine bases. Others were positioned far afield, intended to draw German bombing effort away from critical areas entirely. The decoys were not static. They were adjusted constantly as intelligence suggested changes in German targeting. When it appeared the Germans were focusing on fighter stations, the decoys were repositioned and redesigned to appear as fighter bases. When bombing shifted toward bomber fields, the decoys adapted. Aircraft were added and removed depending on intelligence assessments of what the Germans believed should be present. Dummy vehicles, fake fuel bowsers, and painted personnel were positioned to suggest active operations. The whole system was dynamic, evolving continuously. The test of the decoy network came swiftly. By November 1940, the Germans had begun their bombing campaign in earnest, and the pattern of strikes immediately revealed the success of the deception. Whilst genuine RAF airfields received relatively light damage, dummy installations were being attacked repeatedly. A decoy airfield near Byfleet in Surrey, positioned to divert bombing from the genuine fighter base at Hornchurch, was bombed 6 times. A decoy near Southend received 3 attacks. Across Kent, Essex, and Sussex, the pattern was unmistakable. The Germans were bombing the wrong locations. They were expending their limited bombing capacity on fields that contained nothing but wood and canvas. One particularly illuminating incident occurred in early 1941, when a German reconnaissance aircraft photographed a decoy airfield in Berkshire that had been hastily constructed to appear as a recently damaged forward landing ground. German planners, apparently convinced that this was a vital installation being hastily repaired, launched a major bombing attack. Over 100 tons of ordnance fell on that single location. Not one British life was lost. Not one genuine aircraft was damaged. Yet the expenditure in fuel, bombs, and aircrew time was absolute. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The work we do investigating these extraordinary historical operations depends entirely on your support. Do subscribe if you are interested in Britain's hidden wars and forgotten triumphs. The scale of German resources diverted by the decoy network becomes apparent only when the figures are examined carefully. Estimates, necessarily imprecise given the vagaries of wartime record-keeping and the classified nature of German bombing assessments, suggest that between 15 and 20% of the Luftwaffe's bombing effort during the Battle of Britain and the subsequent campaign was directed at decoy airfields. This represented thousands of tons of ordnance. More significant than the ordnance, however, was the aircrew time. Every sortie flown by a German fighter protecting bombing formations, every bomber crew dispatched to attack what they believed to be vital British installations, represented fuel, maintenance, and human cost that could not be replaced quickly. German fighter production in 1941 stood at approximately 300 aircraft per month. The losses sustained in escorting bombing raids against decoy targets represented a steady drain on reserves that could not be easily replenished. The German equivalent, the Luftwaffe's own decoy network, was comparatively modest. The Germans constructed some dummy airfields, particularly around Berlin and other strategic locations, but the investment was fractional compared to the British effort. German commanders, perhaps overconfident in their superiority, did not believe that systematic deception was necessary. They also lacked, initially, the detailed reconnaissance intelligence that the British possessed about their own airfield layouts. This asymmetry was crucial. The British knew exactly what their genuine bases looked like and could therefore create convincing replicas. The Germans, working partially from incomplete intelligence and assumption, could not match this precision. American aviation resources, when they began arriving in significant numbers in 1942, benefited directly from the lessons learned by the British decoy program. American bases in the United Kingdom were incorporated into the decoy network, and their defensive systems learned from accumulated British experience. The integration of dummy installations with active air defense meant that when the Luftwaffe did locate genuine targets, they often faced not just fighter opposition but also evidence of alternate locations that seemed worth investigating. The operational success of the decoy network was measurable in what did not happen. Throughout 1941 and 1942, as British air strength gradually increased and German bombing intensity declined, the decoy installations continued to absorb a disproportionate share of enemy effort. During the Blitz, from September 1940 to May 1941, decoy airfields were credited with drawing at least 15 major bombing attacks away from genuine installations. The cumulative effect of these diversions was profound. At Hornchurch, one of the most frequently attacked genuine bases during the early war, bombing damage during the critical period of 1940, 41 was considerably lighter than it might have been. Pilot losses from ground attack were reduced. Aircraft losses on the ground were minimized. The airfield remained continuously operational at a time when German strategy depended upon rendering British fighter bases unusable. This was not the only decoy network operating in Britain during the war. Anti-aircraft decoys, oil storage decoys, and even decoys simulating invasion preparations all operated in parallel. But the airfield network was the most ambitious and the most continuously engaged with actual enemy activity. German records, captured after the war, revealed something striking. German planners had been substantially deceived about British airfield strength. German estimates suggested that Britain possessed more operational airfields than was actually the case, largely because the decoy network had successfully convinced them that damaged or secondary installations were still active. This meant that German bombing strategy was shaped by essentially false assumptions about the distribution of British air power. Resources were allocated to targets that did not exist or were less important than believed. The legacy of the airfield decoys extended well beyond 1945. The concept of systematic deception at scale became a foundational element of Cold War strategy. Dummy missile sites, fake weapon systems, and deception networks would play crucial roles in the strategic balance between NATO and the Soviet Union for decades. The principle established during the Battle of Britain, that elaborate, costly deception could be more economical than active defense, would be repeated across different eras. In the modern age, similar principles guide military strategy. Electronic decoys, false radar returns, and deceptive positioning remain central to air defense. But nothing quite matched the physical scale and audacity of the airfield decoys. Today, the sites themselves have largely vanished. The timber frameworks have rotted, the canvas has disintegrated, and the carefully painted markings have weathered away. Some locations are marked by preserved foundations or heritage plaques. A few reconstructed decoys exist in museums, allowing modern visitors to appreciate the sophistication of what was created. At RAF Biggin Hill, where this story began, the Visitor Center acknowledges the role of the decoy network in the station's survival during the critical early months of the war. It is worth pausing to consider what the decoy airfields really represented. On the surface, they were an exercise in deception and misdirection, successful ones certainly, but ultimately passive in their operation. No shots were fired from the dummy installations. No pilots flew from the false runways. They could not shoot down enemy bombers or prevent bombing raids from occurring. What they did was reshape the mathematics of the air war. They took a German advantage and diluted it. They took a finite resource, German bombing capacity, and the fuel reserves that supported it, and forced the enemy to expend that resource on targets that did not matter. In 1940, when the Battle of Britain hung in balance and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, every diversion mattered. Every bombing raid absorbed by a decoy airfield was a raid not striking a real base. Every German fighter escorting bombers to false targets was a fighter not available for other operations. The network functioned as a form of passive defense that required no aircraft, no pilots, and no ordnance to operate. It simply existed, was believed in, and therefore worked. In this sense, the decoy airfield network was perhaps the purest expression of the strategic principle that underlies all deception. The enemy sees what you allow them to see, believes what they think they have discovered, and acts based on false assumptions. By the autumn of 1942, the immediate threat of German air superiority had passed. The Luftwaffe was being pushed backward across multiple theaters. The Battle of Britain had been won, and with it, the question of invasion had been effectively settled. The decoy airfields, their primary purpose achieved, gradually became less critical to the overall war effort. But they continued operating in modified form throughout the war, adapted to new threats and new strategic requirements. The men and women who built, maintained, and operated the decoy network received little recognition during the war itself. Their work was classified, their achievements unpublicized. To speak of what you had done was to potentially compromise the security of others still relying on the deception. Even after the war, the decoy network remained somewhat obscure, overshadowed by more celebrated operations and more obvious military victories. It was not won with fighter aircraft in dramatic dogfights. It was not achieved through the sacrifice of soldiers in combat. It was won through careful planning, meticulous execution, artistic skill, and a willingness to invest resources in something that would never fire a shot. In many ways, this made it more impressive, not less. For 3 years, Britain's phantom airfields stood guard over the real ones, invisible but vital, unsung but indispensable. The final measure of the decoy airfield network's success lies in the historical counterfactual. What if it had not existed? If the Luftwaffe had been able to concentrate its bombing effort exclusively on genuine RAF installations, the results might have been catastrophic. The RAF's narrow margin of survival during 1940 and 1941 depended upon maintaining sufficient aircraft and trained pilots to continue operations. The loss of even one major airfield that could not be repaired might have been decisive. An increase in pilot casualties of 15 or 20% might have collapsed the entire system. The decoys, by absorbing enemy effort and diverting resources, provided the margin that allowed Britain to survive long enough for German strategy to shift elsewhere. This is not speculation. German commanders themselves acknowledged after the war that decoys had been problematic, that their bombing intelligence had been less reliable than they had assumed, and that they had operated under significant misapprehensions about the state of British air defenses. The decoy airfield network did not win the Battle of Britain alone. Brave pilots, adequate aircraft production, effective radar systems, and clear German strategic errors all played their parts. But the network was a significant contributor to the outcome. It was the invisible fortress that protected the visible one. It was the fiction that became more real, militarily, than the truth. and it was a creation of wartime necessity that became one of the most elegant and successful deceptions in military history, even if the world never quite got around to properly celebrating it. The phantom airfields have long since faded, dissolved back into the English countryside from which they were conjured. But their legacy remains. The understanding that in warfare, sometimes the most powerful weapon is one that never fires. Sometimes the greatest victory is one that never needs to be fought.